All right, everybody. Hi.
Hi.
My name is Olivia Currier, and on behalf of Martial Opera and the Oral History Project in Concert, I have the composer Mikel Rouse here with us today. Um, so we're going to interview him and ask him so many fun questions. So let's just jump right into it. So, Mikel Rouse, I just want you to give us a introductory statement. So, how did you get your start? Like, how did music come into your life?
I grew up in a small town in southeast Missouri called Poplar Bluff, and grew up mostly on rock and roll, and then sort of country and western music, and then eventually jazz creeped in. And then I was very lucky. I also was a visual artist, so I went to Kansas City, Missouri, and I did a double major studying painting and filmmaking at the Kansas City Art Institute. And at the time, no longer. Across the street was the Conservatory of Music at UMKC. Now it's on the actual UMKC campus, but back then it was actually this beautiful building that was right across the street from the Art Institute. So it was a really easy commute. And studied composition and theory there, and then formed a band called Ture Ture, and we moved to New York and were fairly successful. And then I formed a chamber group called Mikel Rouse Broken Consort and started making records. And then I guess the second phase of the career was trying to figure out how I could put the visual elements that I'd studied uh, and my love of visual art and filmmaking with music. And so I came up with this opera trilogy, this sort of media opera trilogy. The first opera was Failing Kansas, inspired by the same events that were utilized by Truman Capote in the true crime novel In Cold Blood. Then I followed that with the talk show opera Dennis Cleveland, which was an opera staged as a television talk show. And then the third opera was staged as a live film, and that was called The End of Cinematics. And then I went on to continue doing song cycles and working on a 13-hour installation piece now that was going to premiere, but kind of got delayed by the pandemic. So we're kind of trying to scrape that back together. And that's kind of the overview.
You seem to have done anything and everything as a composer. That's really unique. I feel like that's something that's a pattern that I don't typically see in a lot of new opera and new work composers. So that's all really interesting. But I kind of want to piggyback off of the Failing Kansas, which is the aria that I'm currently studying now in
But
Cold Blood. So I just kind of want to tap into what was your motivation for choosing to turn In Cold Blood into an opera? Just, maybe give a brief synopsis as well, just to kind of give us your thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, I didn't want to do that. I was inspired by all of Capote's writing. I'd read everything he'd written. I thought he didn't invent the nonfiction novel. Other people had done similar things before him, but he really kind of popularized it. And obviously, In Cold Blood was the pinnacle of this idea. And so I wanted to find a writing technique that kind of paralleled that innovation, and that's when I came up with this concept that I called counter poetry. And because there'd already been a film, by Richard Brooks that was really, really faithful to the book, and because I didn't want to go through the issue of dealing with it as a narrative story, I got access to the New York Public Library's Capote archives, and I spent about a year just researching the archives, finding all the trial transcripts, finding songs that Perry Smith, one of the murderers, created. And I basically used the same source material that Capote and Harper Lee collected to make a very different piece, but obviously acknowledging that it's coming from the archive wouldn't be there if he hadn't written the book. So that was my approach, and I was very happy with that approach because it allowed for a very non-narrative. It's a very emotional piece, but it doesn't tell the story, And I worked with an artist that I met at the Art Institute named Cliff Baldwin, and he did the films that I performed the piece with solo. And I told him he could basically use any kind of images or anything you wanted to do as long as he hit certain crucial editing points with the score. And to my surprise, it was just a stunning piece. It doesn't make a lot of sense, in a normal narrative way, but we did it all over the world, and people were pretty blown away by it. And I think it was because it tapped in, rather than the narrative story, it tapped into sort of the emotions that you could feel in a situation like that.
Yeah, I did notice that about Failing Kansas is that it's less of a narrative tale and more of it's more of an emotional musical like mural of sorts. And that's really interesting. I don't think that's something that's really done. Um
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I should also say, there are parallels in you have to remember, I moved to New York in the late 70s, and so there was a lot of really interesting stuff happening at the downtown scene. And hip hop was just exploding, and the idea of performing to pre-recorded tracks was coming out of the Bronx. And then you had composers like Robert Ashley who were doing sort of solo vocal pieces, and so I was very inspired. I got, I didn't invent a lot of this. This was I'm on the shoulders of some pretty important people, but it's definitely not what one would consider traditional opera. And so the thing about Failing Kansas was that, with Dennis Cleveland, the huge music forces with that piece, but with Failing Kansas, I was also trying to stay in the game because I was going through, I guess, the first of 3 recessions I've lived through, and I couldn't get my pop band or my chamber group on the road. So I had to come up with something that could sort of allow me to make a living, but also stay in the game. And so this idea of taking, you know, my voice and my pre-recorded voice, and then in counterpoint to myself, do these performances was pretty crazy, and it worked. Uh, I remember doing a show in Iowa, and a woman came up and she was very emotional. I mean, I had to take her hand and kind of hold it. She loved the show, but it occurred to me at a certain point that I think she thought all those voices were coming from me. And that's the kind of magic of performance, is like, if you're doing it really well and you're pulling it off, it is kind of magical. You kind of don't know where all that's coming from. So that piece ended up being very successful and kind of led the way for the larger scale works to, as we came out of the recession, to slowly get those kinds of works funded.
So would you attribute your style of music could also be attributed to another like group of people that moved to New York in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lineage. The huge fan of John Cage, so the whole New York school. But then you move to people like Phil Glass and Steve Reich, where sort of a more tonal kind of work was happening, and that made sense to me because, like I said, I came out of rock and roll and jazz. And then Ashley, of course, Lamont Young, moving to New York, and seeing people like Sonny Sharrock and James Chance, and the scene. It's hard to describe for people who weren't there, but the scene was so fluid. There were no categories, so you could go to the kitchen, which was sort of this avant-garde space, but you could see the Modern Lovers. Or I remember one of a profound evening was at either Danceteria or Peppermint Lounge, which was a rock club, a dance club, and Phil Glass was there with his ensemble doing the Spaceship from Einstein on the Beach at Rock Volume. And it felt like the roof was going to come off the place. So they're just it's not the time when I got the most recognition, but it was the real seed time for me to be in New York. And sadly, it may never happen again, but there really was a moment where whatever you wanted to do, you could do it. If you wanted to do very traditional opera, that was fine. If you wanted to do blend hip hop with classical, that was fine. Like, there were just no categories for a second, and it was a real inspiring time to come up.
Yeah, it sounds like things were just like really teeming with creativity in a way that maybe today it's not quite the same. But
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
so in so many alternative spaces. I mean, it's hard to even remember them all. Um, And of course, the city was very dangerous then, and it wasn't as corporate. So, and rents weren't as high. So there were a lot of people when people didn't want to be in New York in the '70s. The artists kind of came because they built their own communities and didn't mind living in sort of not great conditions, if they could afford to make their work. And I feel bad for younger people now, especially in a place like New York. I mean, I do think that other locales. My nephew is Brennan Ponder's a great artist, and he's found his community in St. Louis, and that's great. He's got an affordable rent, and he can make the art that he wants to make. But it becomes harder and harder, I think, for young people to be in a place like New York. And also, a scene helps. I mean, a scene, you just don't feel like you're alone. You know.
Yeah, it's certainly like as a young person who, I mean, I'm not in New York, but I am among New Yorkers.
Oh, sure. No, no, you're. The funny thing is, back in the day, when I'm saying back in the day, like the '70s, the '80s, it's like, well, I remember I had a loft on 14th Street, and then I had to move. It was a commercial space, and we couldn't wait out the rent law changing where you could keep that space as a living space. So we lost the loft of your dreams in our like early 20s, and then I had to move up to Hell's Kitchen, which is where I live now, which I love. But back then it felt like I was being exiled to Siberia because the entire scene that I was interested in was below 14th Street. But now, people, all five boroughs are incredibly cool and hip and have their own scenes, and so is Jersey, and so is Pennsylvania. So if you're in the proximity of the city, you're kind of like a New York artist.
I'll take that title.
Yeah, that's one of the good things. I mean, I'm sorry that the rents are so high, but that's one of the good things about the the fact that people had to move. They couldn't live in Manhattan, afford Manhattan, so they went to Brooklyn, and then Brooklyn priced them out, and then they went to Astoria, and all of those places are great. So I'm kind of glad that at least that changed, that people weren't snobs about going to Brooklyn or going to Queens.
Oh no, they're all beautiful areas. I see them
Yeah,
weekly. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
well, that's all. This is all great talking points, but I do want to move on to this
Sure.
next question. Um, I'm gonna piggyback off of Failing Kansas, though. What exactly motivated you to break into opera as a medium, opera as we call it? What motivated you to start writing operas?
It's such a good question. And I do remember having the conversation in the early days with Robert Ashley, because I remember saying in an interview in the mid '90s, opera is like, to most people is like vegetables to kids. They've never tried it, but they know they don't like it. And I remember, I remember Bob saying, because I was almost like, well, should we come up with another? Should I come up with another way to describe these pieces? And I had an agent at the time who said, I struggle with this because what you do is very different than traditional opera and trying to sell it. And I said, okay. So I remember talking to Bob about it, and we just both agreed. It's like that's what it is. It follows into the same tradition, and especially if you think of the larger non-Western tradition, with like Chinese opera and things like that. And it's telling a story, whether it's a non-narrative story or a narrative story, through music, through words, through sounds. And when you think of Wagner, you can also think of the staging, and so some of the opera stagings that I did were very innovative. So it just made, like, you're going to work really hard to come up with a name when this name exists and this name works. So I think it was probably more interesting to bring people into the idea that there's more than one way to think of opera. And I think to a certain extent that was successful. I mean, I think there's a lot of younger ensembles who have come up with, everything from Phil Glass to Bob to some of my stuff. And I think, yeah, I think they kind of get it.
I think that's a necessary conversation because, I mean, if, me as an opera singer, you know, or someone who specializes in the Western tradition,
Yeah,
that kind of, your operas, so to speak, kind of makes us question the idea of, well, what is an opera?
Right.
And how, going forward, how can we include other opera traditions in the scene, so to
Yeah.
speak?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I mean, you see now, I can remember 20 years ago, people who went to see traditional operas could be really offended if the staging was new, like if Robert Wilson did something. And now they really, really accept that. Like now they accept that. So I still think there's a way to go for them to accept a wider variety of musical approaches. But I think they at least understand, and especially if they want to keep younger folks interested, that they've got to think about these issues. So, you can go to the Met now, you can go to what I would consider the uptown traditional places, and you can see some pretty amazing and progressive productions. And that just wasn't the case, 30 years ago. It was uptown and downtown.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. But I think, Michael Rouse's version of an opera is a really neat and profound addition to, to this body of new works that need to be
Oh,
presented.
well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely for it. And, it's interesting because like I said earlier, your operas are more of a mural of emotion and not necessarily a linear story with characters and what have you. So it's a really interesting addition, and I think
Which is one of the things that was so interesting about the talk show opera, because I was I was so fascinated with that phenomenon in the late 80s and the 90s, and I was watching them. And the thing that was so interesting is that they felt like non-narrative works I was seeing downtown. The show starts, a bunch of stuff happens, nothing gets resolved, and the show ends. And I thought, this is insane. This is such a perfect way to think about making an opera. And so when we did Dennis Cleveland, it was so hugely successful. And I think people got that aspect of it. And there actually is, a musical arc that happens in all the pieces where it really does have, a sense of beginning, middle, and end, even if that's not a narrative storyline. And that same effect would happen in Dennis Cleveland, but you're kind of, what was so fun about Cleveland is you're putting people in what should be a very familiar thing. I mean, everybody knew about the talk shows, and everybody went to the talk shows, especially in Times Square. And but now they're going and they're thinking, oh, I'm going to see an opera. But now they're under television lighting and cameras, and they're up on screens, and they're actually part of the entire opera. And their faces and their reactions inform how the music is received. So that to me was a huge success. Plus I thought I was really proud of the music.
that to me just sounds like something younger modern audiences would just absolutely love.
I think so too. I think so too. And like I said, we had a really good run. We toured that piece for about 12 years. We took it all over the place. But yeah, people are always telling me, they think it could go to Broadway or something. And in fact, it almost went off Broadway just as Jonathan Larson's Rent was coming in and we couldn't get theaters. But fortunately, we did get to tour it a lot, and we did get to do a revival in New York City at Lincoln Center. So that was great.
I need an off-Broadway opera of yours to
Yeah,
happen.
that would be, yeah, you and me both.
All right. Well, your music has been described I mean, you've read it. It's been described as so many things, right? It's been described as avant-garde and totalism, and it's been associated with minimalism and just all kinds of really groundbreaking different things. But I just want to know, what does your music mean to you, and do you have a mission as a composer with your sound?
Hmm, such an interesting question. I mean, it obviously means a lot in the sense that it's all I do, and it's all I've done, for, I don't know, 45 years or something, at least professionally. And I guess the greatest thing about what we all do is that it's never, you just, recently Martin Scorsese said something about he's still figuring it out. Kurosawa had said it, and he didn't know what Kurosawa meant, but now that he's of a certain age, he thought, I'm still trying to figure out what this is. And I think maybe that's the best part of it, is like, if you're staying engaged, there's always something to learn, there's always something more interesting, there's always something you haven't thought of. And I have a new record coming out with my memoir in May, and I found something I was interested in, which was this old late 60s drum machine. It was like one of the first drum machines, and so that became a compositional tool. And I'm just kind of amazed that there's always something you can find if you're just keeping your eyes open.
I agree with that. I mean, you said you've been composing for how long? You said 45 years?
Oh, I'm 67 now, so yeah, I've been here since 78 or 79. So yeah, something like that. I can't do the math.
I mean, that is a lifetime of career and just dedication, and it shows in how
It is. Oh, let me just say, and you can read all about that in this book, which will be coming out May 21st. I just got the galleys the other day, so it's an interesting thing. I never thought I'd write a book, and it it I know that you're going to experience this yourself as an artist, but there's just so many ups and downs, and it's very easy to get caught up in the downs, especially when you're trying to finance big productions. And so sometimes it can be easy to remember just how tough it's been. So when I wrote the book, I had this moment, like this sort of, the film It's a Wonderful Life? I had this George Bailey moment where, oh, you really had a wonderful life, Michael. And so it was, I'm glad I did it, even though it was not something I ever intended to do.
I think that's such an interesting thing about being an artist is you actually have no idea the progress you've made until you kind of literally see it with your own two eyes. So
Yeah,
I felt something like that.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, I'm excited to read that book. I assume this is kind of I haven't heard about this book yet, so I'm not sure how under wraps it is yet.
Yeah, oh no, no, I mean, we're starting to do the PR and stuff, and actually we're going to be doing a book event at the same place where the concert's going to be, at Bruno Walter, on June 13th, I think. Yeah. Uh, so yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It's a book. It's a memoir, but it's really based around the work. So there are some stories, and everything is kind of touched on, but it really is it's focused on sort of the larger pieces, all the recordings, stuff like that.
So you have a book coming out, but I also kind of want to know what's next for you. What's next for you as a composer as well?
Um, well, like I said, simultaneous with the book is a new record called Language Barrier, and that's coming out at the same time. And then I'm still working on this 13-hour installation piece, music sort of installation piece called One Boy's Day. And that was going to premiere in 21, and then it got postponed to 22. And now enough time has gone by that we're kind of restructuring and rethinking it. But that's kind of the project that's still the big. The book even ends with a question mark about that project. So we'll see if we can bring it back to existence.
Did you also, I think earlier you mentioned a 13-hour work?
That's the piece I'm talking about. Yeah, it's called One Boy's Day. Yeah,
Oh, okay. I'm
yeah.
excited for that. And is that what kind of work is that? Is that an opera as well?
It's no, but I wouldn't call it an opera. It's based on a late 1940s behavioral research study called One Boy's Day, where 8 researchers switching off every half hour followed a 7-year-old boy through his entire day. So it took 13 hours and 33 minutes. So I got rights to the book, and I've been working on this piece. I started in 2014, so it's been 10 years, and all the music's written, and a lot of the video has been shot. And so now we're just kind of thinking, is there a way that we can kind of bring this back to life? A lot of people, not just me, a lot of people really lost big ideas and big things during the pandemic. So I'm grateful that I was able to keep working, and I was able to do this stuff, make new work. But this piece definitely kind of got sidelined because of all that. And so we're trying to bring it back, and I'm optimistic.
Oh, I can absolutely relate to that. I was mid undergrad when the pandemic hit, and
Can't imagine.
oh my goodness, I being in school during COVID is so mind-boggling.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I was in the middle of a really unique and cool kind of a multimedia like multidiscipline project with the Vernacular Music Center at my school, and it
Oh, cool.
got halted. It was one of the coolest things I was ever gonna do, but it got completely halted because of that. So
Uh,
10 years is a labor of love, so I cannot wait to see that.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'll keep you posted. I'll keep you posted.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap it up with this question.
Okay.
Okay, um, the probably one of the most important questions I have. What advice do you have for the young composers, the young musicians, and the young performers of today?
I mean, such a hard question. It's what did Flaubert say about writing? It's a dog's life, but it's the only life. I think that's kind of it. I think I always go between that quote and something Jasper Johns once said about you kind of have to have no other choice because there's going to be so many hardships and you're going to be treated badly and there's just so many things about it that for maybe it's not for lesser mortals, but if you have to do it, then I think it's it's such a valuable thing for society, it's such a valuable thing for the individual, and it's a really especially in this day and age, it's a really, really hopeful statement to make. It's like you are, as an artist, you're believing in, you're choosing hope, you're choosing to believe in something uh, that's greater than yourself. And I think that to me is, that's always been my motivation. And I'm proud that I got to do it. I mean, I'm just so grateful I got to do it. But I'm not going to tell you it was easy.
Yeah, I always have I have a philosophy as a singer that really always helps me, and I don't, you can agree or disagree, but it's like as a musician, as a performer, you are always a student. You
Oh,
are
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was saying earlier. I mean, it's if you can find a way to stay so engaged with your craft that you're learning at 80, then I think that's a successful life. Yeah.
I mean, as a young composer, did you ever, you were sitting in your New York loft and you were wondering like, am I ever going to make it? Am I ever going to see the fruits of my labor? Is that a question you ever asked yourself?
I think I did. I think everybody does, but I also think that that's also a question that you continually ask, because what does having made it mean? You know, I know a lot of people who are way more famous than me and they're miserable. And I know a lot of people who never got as far as I did and they're still doing their work and they're still dedicated. So I think it's really important to figure out what does that mean, make it and that's really changes over time. You know, I came here, you know, really hungry. I got very lucky, had a lot of good press, a lot of good things happen, but it could just as easily gone the other way. You know, Robert Rauschenberg, the painter, had a great quote. The quote was something to the effect, "Your art is just as good as mine. I just got lucky." And I don't think he was that. I don't think that was false modesty. I mean, I think he's a genius, but I think he really was saying the truth, which is there's a lot of luck involved, you know, and being in the right place at the right time. And the great thing is, you know, some people can take that as like, well, that sucks. I mean, I work really, really hard, and you're telling me it's luck. I go, well, but what I'm telling you is, if you're in the game, you could get lucky. If you're not in the game, if you give up, then you won't. There's no way luck is going to help you because you're not in the game.
It's so true. I mean, it's luck, it's perseverance, and it's we always, it's cheesy, but we always
Yeah,
forget the journey. We always forget the journey, but that's the part that.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, Michael, this has been awesome. So thank you so much for being a part of this oral history project and for sharing your story with us. We're actually just about
Pleasure.
out of time.
Yeah.
But again, I want to thank you so much. And for those who are watching, I want to encourage you to please come out to see our concert on April 27th in the Bruno Walter Auditorium. It's going to be an amazing night of new music and so many different composers and so many artists. And I hope you join us. So thank you so much for joining us and goodbye.
Bye.